to debate this issue because it does point out the utter absurdity of the Labour Party's position on the deal which it wants with the EU, encapsulated in one sentence of the statement which says they want a compromise which, at the bare minimum, needs to involve a commitment to a permanent customs union over and enshrining the Chequers' commitments to regulatory alignment. Well, what a preposterous position that is. It is we will remain subject to decisions taken by the EU, but in which we have had no part to participate and in which we've not had a vote. You know, the Commission, we've got at the moment one Commissioner out of 28. The Council of Ministers, we've got 8.5% of the votes on QMV decisions, and we've got roughly 10% of the seats in the European Parliament. If we were to leave the EU on the kind of arrangements which the Council General has set out today, we would have no votes whatsoever in any of those decisions, and yet we would be subject to whatever decisions the EU made. That, whatever it is not Brexit. And this, I think, points up the fundamental hypocrisy of the Labour Party's position, because they claim to want to respect the result of the referendum, whilst on the other hand committing themselves to a policy which actually produces the exact opposite of leaving the EU, except on the even more damaging situation whereby we can actually have no influence whatsoever over decisions in which currently we do at least have a minimal part to play. And let's be in no doubt that the EU would have no interest whatsoever in taking decisions that were in our interest, and indeed very often would have every interest in doing the opposite, to favour their own member states over the interest of Britain. We would actually be in a worse position than Turkey is now, but at least Turkey is prepared to accept that ignominy because it is, at least theoretically, a candidate member of the EU, whereas we would be the opposite. We would be on the point of departure. So why on earth would we want to make those commitments whilst we were legally outside the EU? And those go to the very heart of what leaving the EU should all be about: taking back control, making decisions for ourselves, making our own laws, and having the British people ultimately as the sovereign body which determines the way in which governments behave. Because the European Commission has made it absolutely clear what the customs union is about. It's about a system of common rules, I'm quoting from one of their documents, a system of common rules which goes beyond the customs union as such, with a common tariff and extend to all aspects of trade policy, such as preferential trade, health and environmental controls, common agricultural and fisheries policies, the protection of our economic interests by non-tariff instruments and external relation policy measures. That is everything which goes to the very heart of trade. And we would be giving up all that under Labour's proposals. We would, in fact, be in a state of vassalage, as Boris Johnson has previously pointed out. And as Mervyn King, the former Governor of the Bank of England, has said, there are arguments for remaining in the EU and there are arguments for leaving the EU. But there is no case whatsoever for giving up the benefits of remaining without obtaining the benefits of leaving. And that is exactly what the Labour policy would mean. And does the Council General not agree with me that the customs tariff which he wants to commit ourselves to in perpetuity is actually a tax on the poor, a tax on working people? There's a 15% tax on footwear and clothes imports, for example, 11.5% tax on coffee, a 17% tax on oranges, which you can't grow in this country anywhere, any more than we can grow coffee. And there are lots of senseless tariffs as well. There's a tariff of 1.7% on swords, cutlasses, bayonets, lances and scabbards. A tax of 15% on unicycles. Now, I don't know what threat the importation of unicycles poses to the British bicycle-making industry, but I can see no justification for that whatsoever. And there's even a 4.7% tax on umbrellas with telescopic shafts. And there are 12,160 of these absurd impositions upon working people, but also, of course, in many other respects, taxes on food and other necessities of life. A 5% VAT on central heating fuel, for example. These are all things which are going to hit the poorest hardest, and that's what the Labour Party is committing itself to. So I do agree with the Council General in one respect, that the tragedy of the situation we've now arrived at, and he said this in answer to the Conservative spokesman, is that Theresa May has made no preparations whatsoever for coping with the dislocation which a no-deal arrangement would inevitably involve. We should have spent the last 3 years actually putting together in outline our trade deals with the rest of the world. We haven't even begun that process. And also, we should have put in process the technical infrastructure for how to cope with trade flows across the United Kingdom borders without, with a tariff regime if one were to be imposed. But also, and my last point is this, that as part and parcel of what the Labour Party proposes is a permanent open-door immigration policy in effect, because that also is an essential part of the 4 freedoms which the single market entails.
And we end where I suspect the member would have preferred to begin.